let me start by saying then that this is a presentation, a dialogue connected to the publication of the book, Dialogues on Consciousness, which is published by Or Books in the USA and by Eris Books in the UK. The book came out of a series of dialogues that were published with the New York Review of Books. So I should say that these conversations between me, myself, and Riccardo, myself being Tim Parks, I write novels. I used to be a professor until last year here in Milan, where I'm speaking now on a very dull afternoon. I'm speaking to Riccardo Manzotti, who you can see with a nice red glass drinking in the other screen. Riccardo's a philosopher who taught at the same university that I was teaching at. So we got to meet at the university, and we got to meet in circumstances that led us to start a series of really very intense conversations. Riccardo had just been, well, he had over many years arrived at a new position on consciousness and indeed the world, as we will see. And I was extremely skeptical about his new position. So we spent many hours discussing this, and out of those many fervid and excited discussions, a number of books have come. I mean, I wrote a book called Out of My Head. Riccardo, in any way with his work, was writing books which usually have the expression "the spread mind" in the title. And then we wrote these dialogues, and then we have this publication. So without more ado, let's get to the issue, because I don't want to waste you with too much background. We're going to be talking about consciousness. We're not going to spend a lot of time defining it, because we could waste a lot of time that way. We're going to say that by consciousness, we are referring to the feeling that accompanies our being in the world, if you want, experience. We're not even going to say our experience. We're not going to say our experience of the world, because that would start splitting things up into an us, an experience, and a world. We're just going to say the feeling of being in the world. And I'm going to kick off, because like the person who's really going to be generating the excitement here, hopefully, is Riccardo. I'm going to kick off by reminding Riccardo that our conversations all started when he, at a famous conference meeting, stood up and said to a neuroscientist, he said, there are no images in the brain. Okay, there are no images in the brain. We've been talking about the way we look at works of art. And Riccardo said, no, there are no images in the brain. Riccardo, can you tell us why that idea of yours, which is so central to your thinking, what is behind that idea, that whether there are images or not in the brain?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. I mean, this is probably the most difficult problem at the center of our understanding of ourselves and namely, how is that the world presents itself? How is that we can have an experience of the world? And this idea that may seem extremely obvious to many, because what might seem easier than opening our eyes and seeing the world is in fact the biggest problem in the scientific picture of reality. Why it is so different? You mentioned the idea of images, and let me get back to that.
The idea of images. Yeah.
Right. So when we open our eyes, what do we see? Do we see the world, or do we see images of the world? Now, if we go for the first option, it's a mystery, because nobody knows how is that the external world is able to get through our eyes and reach us. If we go for the second option, namely we see images, that things are even worse. Because what is an image? Who has ever seen an image? Tim, for example, have you ever seen an image? I think I challenge you about that, because you saw pictures, you saw canvases, you saw photos, but all such objects are just a flat physical object. They are not literally images.
So an
So
image, wait, I mean, let's get this straight. An image is something that substitutes for something else, if you want. Okay, so we could use the word image by saying that, for example, behind your head now, there is an image of an apple. Well, like, we know it's not an apple, so it's a drawing of an apple, and then we use the word image, right? So we find, and I remember the incident very clearly, we find a neuroscientist saying the image of this, I think he was talking about a painting, the image of this painting is generated in your head by these neurons in this place. Okay. So this was very much like an Inside Out, like the movie, where you imagine that sort of something lights up. Okay. Now, your point has always been that nobody has ever actually seen these images inside your head, right?
Yeah, the claim that inside our brain there are images of the external world and that we see the world because of images inside our brain is actually an empty claim. It has never been proved that inside our brain there is anything like an image of the external world. In fact, if we look inside brains, we find only neurons, we find neural firings, we have pattern of electrochemical activations, but nothing neuroscientists have found inside the brain is like an image. So the idea that inside our brain there is a little screen, a little display that shows the external world as though it was a silver screen on which we could see images of the external reality is clearly unsupported by neuroscientific evidence. Inside the brain, there are no images. There are just neurons, and they are just doing what they do. Namely, they exchange chemical activity. They don't produce images. They don't generate.
So, for example, if we studied the neurons in the brain without, we just studied the neurons in the brain, nothing in those neurons would tell us about the nature of experience, right?
No.
On the other hand, we can correlate our experiences with different areas of the brain, right? So, you know, neuroscience has been very good at establishing correlates of the experiences that we're having.
Yes, in the last 30 years, there have been outstanding findings about the correlation between neural activity and our experience. However, there has not been a single result about how a neuron or neural activity can produce anything like images. This is something that is worth of consideration, because basically neuroscientists have been looking for our conscious experience in the brain painstakingly for 30, 40 years without finding anything like our mind, our conscious experience of the world. And this would suggest them to look elsewhere, but they never admitted their failure.
Yeah. Okay. So let's not be too hard on them yet. You know, they're doing a very good job, it seems to me, of mapping the brain and putting the brain in relation to things happening to us or happening outside, as it were. Let's say this: implicit in this idea that our experience, for example, our visual experience, is an image in the head and not the world outside, is the idea that we don't really see the world, right?
Yes,
So,
there are
so
two ideas.
we are kind of inventing the world in our neurons. So, for example, on the one hand, they talk about representations or images in the head, but on the other hand, neuroscience will talk, and science in general, will say that, for example, there is no color in the world, whereas for us, the world seems to be made up uh, totally of color. If I look around, every object is colored to me.
Yes, this idea is a very old idea, suggested originally by Galileo 4 centuries ago, in 1623, when he suggested that all that we see is created inside the brain, inside the living organism, to use his own words. And why did he suggest anything like that? Mostly because he believed that we are separate from the external world and that we are somehow a little homunculus, a little man inside the head, peering through our senses to see the world. So that's why the metaphor of the senses as windows through which we see the external world is so popular, because it's the idea that we can see in many places, both in neuroscientific textbooks and in recent movies, as Inside Out by Pixar. The idea that the world is out there and that we are here inside our body, somehow peering at the world through our eyes. In order to succeed in doing that, we need something from the external world to get inside our body, our brain. And this something is the notion of an image. Or, to use a more modern terminology, it is the notion of information. But the fact is that nobody knows how to bring information with the properties of the external world inside the brain. How could the brain know whether the signals that it gets from the external world are related with, say, with colors or sounds or whatever? Nobody knows how that might happen. So people have developed this, I would say, rather bizarre idea, although it is very widespread, that the brain is able to generate a virtual world with color, sound, smell, taste, whatever, and that as a consequence, all these properties are not real properties in the external world, but they are just illusions created inside the brain. This
Okay.
is
Okay. So let's
illusory
stop.
experience.
So what you're describing, basically, you're describing something called internalism, right? Which is the dominant uh, hypothesis about consciousness. That is, there's a world out there which is in fact not colored and which has no sound and no smell. Um, I'm thinking of Eagleman's description of the world. You'd be shocked if I told you that the world has no smell, no sound, no color, etc. So science believes that, or many scientists believe that this is the case, and that all these experiences, that our world is in fact generated in the brain. Now, as a result of this, it means that everything that we know is basically false. Okay. Um, and it also means that we need scientists to tell us what the world is really like. Um, because our experience is not. How scientists know what the world is really like when we don't is another interesting question. But so basically, what we want to do at the beginning of this dialogue is put a big question mark around what is the dominant orthodoxy about consciousness now, which is there is a world out there. It comes to us in packages of information through our eyes, our ears, our nose, our touch, our tongues. it comes to us in packages of information, and then it is sort of miraculously transformed as the Coca-Cola that Riccardo is no doubt being paid to advertise is transformed now. It's transformed into things like a sweet taste or
Right.
and so on and so forth. So that is the dominant position, which you feel is unscientific and goes against all the laws of physics as we know them.
Right. Yes, if I may interrupt you, I mean, it is a completely, it is a terrible idea. It is a terrible idea because it is logically self-contradictory. Because if we say that in the physical world there are no colors, sound, smell, tastes, how is it possible that the brain generates them? Because the brain is part of the physical world. So we are asking to the brain to do something that it is impossible in the physical world. So it is logically self-contradictory. It is empirically completely unsound. Why? Because no one has ever been able to explain how can neurons produce anything which is not physical. We know what's the goal of neurons. The goal of neurons is to produce acetylcholine, to produce neurotransmitters, and to generate signals that have to be integrated through other neural networks. But that's not like producing an image, just chemical activity. So we are able to explain what the neuron does from a physical perspective in terms of neurotransmitters and everything, but we don't have a clue about how the neuron may produce anything like an image, because an image is not physical in this traditional framework.
Okay.
And finally, it is a terrible idea, physically speaking, because it would suggest that there is something, namely the brain, that is able to have an experience of something completely different from the brain. In fact, in our experience, we don't find anything like neurons. We find the properties of the external object, but not the properties of our brain as it is.
Right. We don't actually feel our brains very much at all. Okay. So what you're saying is that the problem of consciousness, the fact of us feeling the world and so on, is actually a challenge to the scientific picture that we have of the world. Like the consciousness doesn't actually fit in the scientific picture that dominates our modern vision of the world. Okay, so presumably that means that either we've got something wrong in our general picture of the world, or I don't know, we have to go to some dualist idea where the world is not made up of one thing, but actually there are two things, and one of them's in your head and all the rest is outside.
Right. Clearly, if we state the problem in this way, if we assume that we are different from the external world, and we assume that we somehow have an experience of the external world through the information getting through our senses, there is something that doesn't work. That doesn't fit with our understanding of physical reality. So there must be something that is the wrong assumption. We must move from some wrong assumption. We must get back to the drawing board of the scientific picture of reality, and we must find a way in which our own existence, our own experience of the world might take place, might be a fact of reality, without having to add any extra hypothesis, as it is the hypothesis from neuroscience that our brain has the magic power of creating a virtual world.
Okay,
now,
can we just talk a little about magic and magic power, and in particular with relation to the word information? Okay, because information is now a word that's come to take on a sort of mysterious reality of its own. I mean, obviously there's information about train timetables, but But there's this idea that everything is information. You know, I look around me at the room, it's all information. It's coming into my head through my senses. And then we have a few philosophers, neuroscientists, who are working on the idea that there's something called integrated information, which is sort of information with a magical element in it.
Right.
And that so can you, because it seems to me that one of the things that's happened is that there is a certain embarrassment in neuroscience about the difficulty of explaining why these neurons are creating our experience of the world. And in response to this embarrassment, one of the dominant, perhaps the dominant, promising hypothesis, I think, is the expression. The promising hypothesis is this idea of integrated information. So before we move on to your position, maybe we could just explain what integrated information is, and then hear what you have to say about that.
Right. Well, the notion of information is extremely popular, as we all know it. But let me ask you to consider these questions. Have you ever seen a bit of information? Have you ever seen information as such? Or have you seen only what happens on devices because of information? So information is not really...
I don't know. How could I see information? I mean, I can see a train timetable, but those are just numbers and words, okay?
Right.
I can see out of the window. No, obviously, but I don't see my neurons either, but my neurons exist.
But you can see someone else's neurons.
Yes,
However, you cannot see someone else's information.
Oh,
because information is not a physical stuff which exists over and above the matter the world is made of. Information is a way to describe what it takes place between systems that communicate together. So that's why we have information.
Communicate together sounds rather mysterious to me now. It sounds like systems talking to each other.
Basically, information is one way to measure how much two different systems are causally connected together. I'll make you a very simple example. If I take a picture of you on a holiday, on a beach, and then I print this picture and I show this picture to our friends, they're gonna believe that what they see on the picture is a proof that you have been on a beach, because they take that there has to be a correlation between what goes on a piece of paper where there's a printed picture and what happened during the holiday. Likewise, when we speak to someone at the phone, we expect that the noise, that the sounds that we hear at one end of a phone reflects the sounds, the voice of the person we're speaking with at the other end of the phone. So information is one way to measure how much different physical systems in the world are causally coupled together. What happens at one end of a communication channel happens also at the other end of the communication channel.
So it's actually a kind of catch-all term for hundreds of things that are happening between two objects. So for example, information, if we were talking about the information that leads me to see you on the screen, I don't know, do I see you on the screen? Do I see an image of you? So there are all kinds of things involved. There's what's happening in the computer, and then there's the light, and then there's my eyes, and there are photons, and there are my record.
Look at what is happening here. I'm here in Italy, I'm in front of a camera, and for example, I am bowing my head, like that way. Yeah. And then you have, in front of yourself at home, you have another screen and the other screen is showing a picture, is showing a configuration of lights that are more or less reflecting, mirroring the bowing of my head. Right now, or I'm waving my hand, and there is a picture of a hand waving at the other end. There's no need to assume that beyond, over and above the causal processes taking place between my camera, the electrons, the internet, and so forth, there is also an additional mysterious stuff called information. Information originally has been introduced by people like Claude Shannon to define the probability that what happens at one end of the communication channel is reflected by what has happened at the other end of the channel.
Okay. So can we...
Afterward, now let me tell you this thing. Afterward, people started to talk a lot about information as though it was something flowing from one place to another place, or something that might be stored, that can be transmitted, that can be processed. And this idea that information is a kind of additional stuff is completely wrong. Information is not like electricity. So when we have electricity, electricity is physically flowing through the wires. Information is not flowing like physics. And the proof of that is that you cannot measure information just by looking at what goes on inside a wire or in a Wi-Fi. You need to know something more about the physical systems that are connected together.
Okay, so what is integrated information then, and why does it solve the problem of consciousness according to some people?
Right. What do we get from the external world? Once again, people start from the assumption that we are somehow inside our body. And therefore we must...
It's not really such a bad assumption. I mean, I feel I need my eyes, I need my head. I feel if I'm anywhere, it must be here.
Yeah, people believe to be somehow located where their body is because of various reasons. Some of them are social. When I refer to you, usually I refer to your body. When I want to point at Tim, usually I point with my finger at Tim's body. And usually we are at the same, I mean, all our senses are kind of centered around our head. And so we have what Daniel Dennett called the center of perceptual gravity, namely the fact that all our sensations seems to be located around our head. And then there are also reasons related with the fact that we know that our body is necessary to have an experience of the world. So if, for example, we get sick or we have a seizure or we have some condition, then we have a different experience. If our body is destroyed, we stop having an experience of the world.
We presume.
These are quite dramatic examples of the fact that the body has surely a fundamental role in allowing us to experience the world. But they don't show, they don't prove that our experience is located inside the body, nor that it is...
Okay, let's get back to the integrated information, otherwise we're going to forget. So, okay.
Recently we all got very fond of the metaphor that the brain is a computer. And inside the computer, we know there is information. So a lot of people started to suggest that our brain works like a computer. And that
so when we say there's information in a computer, we just mean that there are lots of little switches turning on and off in relation to each other, right? There's no thing called information inside the computer.
And that's a completely wrong metaphor. So as popular as it was, it is completely and not the right metaphor, because neurons don't work like electronic switches. So the architecture of our brain is completely different from a Turing machine. But because of historical and in a way, because of many science fiction movies, a lot of people took seriously the idea that our mind is the software that is run on on the hardware, which is our brain.
Mm.
And so many people like very much the idea that inside our brain there is a lot of information, and that this information is basically our mind, our conscious experience. Only they didn't know how to explain that information has the properties of our experience. Why should information have any of the familiar properties of our world? Why should information has color? I often ask to my student whether bits have any color, and of course bits don't have color. How could anything like numbers transmogrify into phenomenal experience? We all have seen movies like The Matrix. In The Matrix, they show a waterfall of green characters, of green numbers, and then, as if by magic, those numbers becomes a beautiful woman with a red dress, or they become the Matrix world. Of course, this is magic. There's no evidence that anything like that may happen. But most of the people took that model as it was a scientific idea.
Mm.
But it is like believing that we can transform copper into gold. That is simply impossible. To imagine that neural activity can transform into phenomenal experience.
But this is what integrated information is about, isn't it?
So, exactly. To get back to integrated information, some people try to find good reason to give information some kind of additional property. In particular, Giulio Tononi, who is a neuroscientist, suggested that in our brain, there is some kind of spatial information. There is a special kind of information. And for some reason that he never properly explained, this magic kind of information should produce the familiar properties of our experience, should have phenomenal character. But
isn't it a question of, I mean, why is that the word integrated? Isn't it a question of the extraordinary number of connections in the brain?
Well, the main reason why he used the word integrated information has to do with the fact that we perceive our existence as a unity, as a whole. So it seems that one of the things that has to be explained when we explain how the brain works is how does the brain move from a collection of separate neural activities to something which has unity, which is the self. So basically, we move from neural activity, which is a plural notion, many neurons, to one self. How is that possible? So Tononi suggested that that there is a special kind of processing of information that lump together all the information in the brain and produces a unified self. Yeah. And this is very similar, in my understanding, to a scientific theory of the soul. Because in the end, Tononi is suggesting that in the brain we have something which is invisible, which is immaterial, and we call it integrated information. Now, for me, something which is invisible, that cannot be seen, and that is not material, is just the old notion of the soul disguised in a scientific jargon.
Okay, so basically, whatever way we look at internalism, it always seems to produce some kind of dualism. That is, that things that happen in the brain have to be magical in order to explain that the world out there is actually inside our heads, right?
Right.
Obviously, we could spend time looking at other approaches to consciousness. There's an approach called enactivism, which tries to move us a little bit away from the brain and talk about the way the body interacts with the world as the basis of consciousness. But I don't think we've really got time to do that, and also to start looking in any serious way about your approach. So I think it's time for you to tell us if we don't have images in our heads, okay, if in our heads there are only neurons, although there are 85 billion of them and they're doing an awful lot of stuff, okay, but if we don't have the world inside our head, and so as I see it, you're saying we don't actually have experience inside our head. That's what you're saying, isn't it?
Right.
Right. If it's not inside our head, how are you going to explain to us where it is and what it is? Okay, so let's, because this is the million-dollar question that we drank a lot of beers over. So let's try and find a way of talking about it.
Yeah. As I said before, I mean, if people have been looking inside the brain for years and they haven't found anything like our experience, it would make sense to look elsewhere, but not to pretend to make some extraordinary hypothesis as though there has to be some magical phenomenon. Let's look at what we have. So let's consider a very simple situation, standard perception. So let's take advantage of these two images that I have at my back. We have a brain, we have a body here, and then we have an object here. We have an apple.
Is that a deliberately androgynous head?
Yeah, I did. That's the outcome of my limited drawing skills.
Oh, so you draw this?
Yes,
You
so I apologize
okay.
if it doesn't look good enough, but I think it makes the point. So we have a body, a brain, and then we have an external object. Let's suppose to be in the simplest case, we perceive an apple and we have an experience of an apple. Now, in such a simple case,
Can I stop you? Because you've actually got three things here. You've got a we or an I, you've got an apple, and you've got an experience. And you're saying that the I possesses the experience of the apple. I mean, are you happy with that?
Not at all, not at all. Actually, I think that we have to be very careful in the way in which we frame the problem. And it is plain that when we use an expression like I see an apple, we have at least two entities that are utterly mysterious, namely the I, the self, and the seeing. The only thing that it's familiar, that it is very in a way down to earth, is the apple itself.
So we've seen apples, but we've never seen a self experience.
We've never seen a self, and we've never seen the process of seeing, which is a very mysterious process.
Yeah, but we know a lot about the eye. We know a lot about what happens to the electrical impulses that come out.
But of course, nothing of that is seeing. An eye doesn't see by itself. If we were able to keep an eye alive in a life support system, I think we will all agree that the eye doesn't see. And also the neural activity per se is not seeing. We don't really know where seeing takes place. It's a very mysterious process.
So seeing is just a word that we use to say that my experience at the moment is visual and it's an apple. I see the apple.
Exactly. Oh. So I ask you to consider your experience of the apple when you watch an apple, and wonder if there is any physical object, any physical entity at that very moment in which you have an experience of the apple, in which there is an apple as part of your experience, if there is anything physical that is very close, whose properties are very much like the properties of your experience of the apple. So once again...
Wait a minute. You divide, so we've got experience of apple and we've got apple, right? That's what, like the only thing that's like my experience of the apple is the apple. I mean, what else could be like my experience of the apple? So exactly. why are we using two words? Why have we got the experience and the apple?
Exactly. So it seems that the fact that we distinguish between the apple and the experience of the apple is not there is anything like such a distinction in our world. We use that
When
distinction.
we go away, we know that the apple will still be there, as if we haven't eaten it. So we know that my experience, as it were, at every moment kind of meets the apple and then leaves the apple, right?
Yeah, but I think it is deeper than that. I think that we need to assume that we don't see that. I think that we need to assume that that the experience of the apple and the apple are different, has to do with our belief that we are separate from the apple. So when we have to describe
our body is separate from the apple.
our
right?
body, our
Right.
body is surely separate from the apple. That's a fact. The
Mhm.
body is here and the apple is there. That's a fact, no doubt about that. But what we don't know is where is our experience. We don't know exactly where we are located. And we assume we must be located in the body. And because we make that assumption, we need to have something going from the apple to the body. We need to have something like the image. We need to have something in the body that plays the role of the apple. And we call this imaginary entity the experience of the apple. But then we are not able to find anything like the experience of the apple in the brain. We are not able to find anything like the image of the apple in the brain. And so we are left with a mystery. The solution to this problem is not to look for an image of the apple inside the brain or to try to give magic power to the brain. The solution to this problem is much simpler, is to accept the fact that our experience of the apple is nothing but the apple itself. If we place here the thing that is one with our experience, so basically there aren't two things. There isn't the apple and the experience of the apple. There is just the apple. And the apple is just the right physical thing to be the kind of things that we find in our world.
Okay, so stop. So what we're saying is that the thing that I call me, which is a sort of ongoing accumulation of my experience, okay, is in fact nothing more than an accumulation of the objects that my body is in contact with, right? Is that what you're saying?
Well said, well said.
Right. But so what is the nature then? I mean, this apple that I experience, that everybody I'm sure has always thought there is an apple. I go away, the apple is there, and it's the same apple that I experience. But surely, so I'm trying to point out that if we take your position, that in fact what I call myself is the world in contact with my body. Okay. If I do that, then I'm going to have to change my idea of what an object is, right?
Exactly.
Because my experience of the apple is not, for example, I'm not experiencing the atoms inside the apple. I'm not experiencing I don't know if there's a worm in there. Okay. I mean, there are all kinds of things about the apple that are not my experience of the apple.
Right. In fact, we need to revise a little bit the notion of the object. And the best way to revise the notion of the object is to start from an example of a very simple physical property, which is the property of velocity.
Velocity.
Velocity. So if we take an object has a different velocity for any other object. And there's nothing mysterious in that. We know that velocity is relative. So,
okay, so for example, if I'm in my car going along, and I haven't been in my car for a long time, if I'm in my car going along, obviously all kinds of things are moving. There are cars coming to me at one velocity, cars coming. So my car has no one velocity. Its velocity is relative to all the other objects around it, right?
Exactly. Exactly. So velocity, there's no such a thing as absolute velocity. Velocity is always relative to another object.
Mm.
That is a very interesting fact in the physical world, because it allows everything to be, to some extent, different relative to everything else. So that would suggest that, for example, the same object is what it is relative to your body, and the same object may be something else or something slightly different relative to my body, because my body is slightly different. In the case of velocity,
relative to a dog's body, or dare I name the animal, a bat's body.
Or exactly, or even different relative to a table, or to the floor, or to another object. We don't need living organisms. Of course, complex.
But can I stop you, because this is obviously the we're getting to the, at least the basic core of your idea, even though what we're saying is that the property of any object, okay, depends on the objects it's in relation with. Like, the properties are not absolute to the object, okay?
Yeah,
and
this is a claim that I'm not the only one to make it, but it's a claim that we get from physics. Weight, for example, is different here or on the moon, the weight of an object, or on another planet. And the same holds true for basically all of the properties that we have an experience of.
So you're saying that no object is in fact a sort of absolute thing, so that when science says, if you could see the world as it really was, as it really is, you would find that it has no color. You're saying that that has no meaning, because there is no world as it really is. There are objects which are real in relation to each other.
We know that all physical properties, to make sense, they need to be measured. In order to measure them, it means that they need to be what they are relative to the measurement instrument. So all physical properties are defined in relation relative to something else. Physics and science in general has tried to organize a collection of reliable and standardized ways to measure properties, so that we measure them always relative to another physical object, which is always the same. We call this standardized additional physical object the measurement, the instrument of measure. So we introduce a ruler, which has to be always the same ruler, and we measure length relative to that ruler.
Even though the experience of the object is going to be that it's very small if it's far away, and very big if it's close up.
Of course, yes. But my point is that yeah. But my point is that in physics, everything has to be defined relative to something else. For example, how long is the 1 meter sample in Paris? How long is 1 meter? 1 meter. So it doesn't make sense. One cannot ask how long is 1 meter, but you can ask a different question. You can ask, how long is your table? And you may say, your table is 2 meters long. What does that mean? It means that my table is twice as long as the ruler that we keep in Paris, which is 1 meter long. But there isn't such a thing as being absolutely 1 meter long. So all measurements are all relative. Likewise, everything we see.
I feel that, what we've been talking for about, I don't know, probably 45 minutes or something like that. And I feel we need to get to this point. What you're saying is that our experience at any moment, okay, is simply the result of the relation between the body and the object. So we have a simultaneity between body and object, like that is that at this moment I am here and the object is also here, which can be any of the things around me. And that simultaneity of these two things creates this third thing, experience. Is that right? Or not? Or not?
No,
or is
no.
it?
I wouldn't say that, because that would suggest that there are two things in addition to our body and external object. It would suggest that there is a third thing, which is experience. No, I wouldn't say that. I'm saying that there are two things, namely the object and the body here. No, sorry, and the body. There are two things, as in the previous drawing I made, and both are physical. There is the external object and my body. They're both physical. And I need to find out which one is one and the same with my experience. Neuroscience has tried to place my experience in the brain or in the body. In fact, a famous theory about the mind in neuroscience has been called the mind-brain identity. The mind-brain identity didn't work because nobody has been able to show how the brain can be like the mind. Nobody has been able to show how the properties of the brain can match with the properties of the mind, with our conscious experience. I am making the alternative hypothesis. I am wondering, I am taking seriously into consideration whether our experience might be one with the external object.
Okay.
An external object which is not the naive object of naive physicalism, namely an object which is always the same, which doesn't change, an object which is absolute. The object that I want to take into consideration is a relative object, is the object that takes place relative to our body. And like relative velocity, it might be different for each of us because each of us has a different body. So each of us may bring into existence different objects and different worlds.
So I want to move on to a couple of questions, but let me kind of, before we do that, let me just sort of make a quick summary of this rather drastic, because I remember how difficult it was for me to really believe that you were saying what you were saying. So you are saying that experience is nothing other than the world in relation to our body. Okay. And our body is an incredibly complicated piece of equipment that allows the world to appear be. The experiences are. How does this begin to explain things like thinking, things like language in my head, if I can use that expression? How does it begin to explain dreaming, where there is no external object, and so surely this must be happening in my head? So there are all kinds of questions that are immediately raised by your position, and these are the questions that we try to discuss at length in this book, and that we still discuss sometimes when we get together. So that's your position. I want to see now, I'm just going to click open the questions. So you're going to have to bear with me for a moment. You know, some of these questions are quite tricky. I'm going to throw one out to Riccardo so that I will have the chance to read the others. So I'm going to read the first question, which is really taking us where I'd already suggested. Vanessa asks, when we close our eyes and fantasize about certain images, what is happening? What is that? And what about the images we see in dreams? So this is like, you know,
Yeah,
it might take you
that's
half an hour to answer this
no, no,
question.
no. Yes, yes. I'll try to be brief. Now, what's the point? I mean, of course, dreams and hallucination have been the main reason why a lot of people believe that in our brain we have the capability to create a virtual world, because that's exactly what it seems to happen when we have such experiences. However, uh, nobody knows how could that happen, because nobody has ever been able to find the place where our dream take place inside the brain. So is it possible to provide a different explanation? I think it is. I need to ask you to start from simple perception. When we perceive the world, the physical object that we perceive is not taking place at the same time in which the neural activity takes place afterwards. Because there is always some time span, there is always some time delay between the external object and whatever it takes place in our brain. We know that everything takes place, everything takes time in order to happen. Now, in standard perception, this time span is small, between 10 milliseconds to a few hundred milliseconds, depending on what we are perceiving. But we can imagine that the time span between an external event and the resulting effect in one's brain may take longer. How much? As much as we like. So, in principle, why should our previous life, why should all the events in our life not continue to produce effects in our brain? And that would explain why we dream. We dream because we keep perceiving the world we've been living in. We keep perceiving our previous life, only we perceive it in new combinations. Because when we sleep, we are no longer constrained by what is taking place in our proximal surroundings. We perceive all our life in whatever combination it might happen. And such a delayed and reshuffled perception is what we call dreams or hallucination. Do we have any proof of that, any empirical proof of that? Yes, we have. And the proof is that nobody has ever been able to dream something whose constituents have not been part of one's life before. For example, there's no evidence that a congenitally born blind subject is able to dream of a color. Our dreams are made of the stuff we met in our life. If we had the color machine in the brain, I could imagine that occasionally during dreams, this color machine produces wrong mental colors, produces colors that we have never met in our life. And that never happens. And that, I think, is a strong evidence that whatever dreams are made of is not created inside the brain, but is really made of the same stuff we met in our everyday life. So to cut a long story short, dreams or image or the so-called images are nothing but our capacity to continue to perceive the external world.
Okay. And they remain external.
And it remains external. There's no reason. I mean, let me make you another analogy, another metaphor. Suppose that you are speaking with an astronaut. So you speak with an astronaut, like in Interstellar or in certain movies. At first, the astronaut is close to Earth. So there's almost no time delay between you and the astronaut. You can speak like we are doing right now. There's no time delay. But now suppose that on his starship, the astronaut is going farther and farther away. So the time delay between you and what the astronaut says increases up to a point where to get an answer from the astronaut will take, say, 20 minutes, 20 hours, 20 days. There's no limit. That's exactly, but the astronaut would still be physically somewhere at some place, and the conversation would still be a conversation. Only it will take, it will
But
get
what I
slow.
would be hearing would be what was produced by the amplifier next to me. Uh,
Exactly.
what I hear is not the astronaut, but the amplifier.
Exactly, but you would be still speaking with the astronaut. You would not be speaking with the speakers
Uh,
because the astronaut is very far away. The, in the case of the,
can I say that the most difficult part of your theory to get a hand around is this idea that that there is this privileged kind of experience with the simultaneous world, but that also experience continues, and there continues to be a contact with the object, even at a distance of time. I think that's a very difficult question to deal with, and we did talk a lot about that in the book. Let me move on though to another question. I don't know how many. These questions are, some of them are very
they're excellent.
interesting.
I like them. They're excellent.
Yeah, they're fascinating questions. Let me just ask this one. Much of this discussion revolves around visual perception, and it's true that in fact an awful lot of discussion about experience revolves around visual perception. Does the discussion get cast in a different light when discussing more direct modes of perception? The word direct is in inverted commas, like hearing, smell. I don't know if hearing is more direct. Smell, touch, taste. Is there something about visual perception that reinforces subject-object distinction?
In all such case, we know that there's a difference between the sensor organs and the object that is perceived. So we know that the eye cannot see itself, but sees something else. We know that ears cannot hear themselves, but of course they hear something else. The finger cannot touch itself, the tongue cannot taste itself, and so forth. So there's always another object that, or the properties of another object that takes place relative to a sensor organs, whatever it is. In all such cases, our experience is not made by our body, that is modified by the external object, but it is made by the external object itself. When I place some substance on my tongue, my experience of taste is not the taste of the tongue. When that substance is on my tongue, is in contact with my tongue, my experience of the taste is somehow a property of the food that I am swallowing. How is that piece of food, the property of that piece of food, is experienced by me if I was a brain waiting for the information to get in? Because information, as I said before, is not only colorless, but is also tasteless. And once again, we would not know how is it possible for the property of a piece of food to reach the brain. But at that moment, we are the food, like Proudhon said. We are, at that moment, when we eat something, we are the food that we eat. When we hear something, we are the sound of the thunder. When,
yeah, well, T.S. Eliot said, "I am the music as long as the music lasts." Can I say for our brave listeners who are still on board, that this question of different modes of perception of the same object, or of the same whatever it is out there, was one of my epiphanies when I began to understand what Riccardo was talking about with the relative object. For example, if I feel inside my pocket now, I feel my wallet, and I'm glad they told me I'm always reassured when my wallet is there, and it's a moment of terror when it isn't there. If I feel it, and so I feel this kind of smooth thing, and I feel its hardness under the smoothness. If I pull it out and show it to you, and I've got my declaration to explain where I'm going when I go to the shops inside for the coronavirus crisis. if I pull it out, the visual experience of this is a completely different thing. Okay. And if I put it down on the table, the touch experience actually ceases to exist. The smooth, where does smoothness exist now? Where does hardness exist? So I began to understand, yes, this object is relative to either my physical touching or to my visual seeing. As with food, there is a relative object, which is the piece of bread you look at, or the apple that you look at, and there is a relative object that is the taste of the apple breaking down in your mouth. Riccardo, do you want to choose another of these questions, and we'll maybe just do a couple more before calling it a day?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would like to reply to all of those questions, but we will choose just a few of them. So, Andy is asking, if there is no such thing as information, why assume there is such a thing as an experience? And of course, there's no need to make such an assumption. The solution is to stop assuming that there is a world and that there is an appearance of that world. So in a way, we are doing a reduction that it is even stronger than the traditional phenomenological reduction of the world to one's experience. We are saying there's no need to assume that there is an experience in addition to the physical world. There is just the physical world. And if we know where to look, we are going to find ourselves. We introduced the idea both of information and of experience because we made a mistake in placing ourselves. We place ourselves in the body. And because of that, we needed to add something else, namely experience, to make ends meet. But if we place ourselves in the world itself, there's no longer any need to have all this complicated transmission of information that is then transmogrified into phenomenal character, which is used in order to build a perception, a model of the external world by nobody knows what. We just have the world with all its features as they take place relative to our body.
Well, so I think we should move towards the end. There is a question that I can answer in 2 seconds, and then there is a question that I think we could close on. Okay, because I don't know if we want to be going on as it were forever. So we have a question: how about dreams that include creatures from fantasies such as dragons and so on? And there, I'm glad to say that Riccardo once pointed to me to the place in Descartes where he discusses this very thing and says that whenever we try to have fantasy objects, we always put together bits of existing animals. So the dragon is classically made up of bits of lizard and bits of bird and so on and so forth, and then we put fire in its throat and so on and so forth. Riccardo's idea of dreams is very much that that we remain in contact with the world with which we've previously been in contact, and we muddle it up. Somebody else asked whether that's compatible with Freud's theory of the interpretation of dreams, and I really think if we start to go there, we're going to be here all night. But I'd like us to close with this question that I think is a very pertinent question. One of my big problems talking to Riccardo was that I was never sure whether I was talking to a nutcase or not. Now, I'm going to say that in the sense that here we are in the 21st century now, and we had this, we all grow up with this idea that science has actually got it pretty well sorted out until we got to the coronavirus, which has made it clear that there are a lot of things they don't know about that. And then Riccardo comes along and points out to me that actually science makes no sense at all in relation to ideas about consciousness. And then he comes out with this very powerful and very interesting idea that, you know, when I look at, what I look at is my experience, and that's it. Okay. So somebody has asked the question, why aren't people taking you more seriously, as it were, or are they taking you seriously? So what is the state of play here? Are your ideas completely unacceptable? Are they in line with science? Do they actually fly in the face of any science? Let's end with you talking about your project and where you're up to, as it were, with the skeptics.
Right. Yes. Actually, I think there are two kind of new theories. Those that are difficult because they are objectively difficult, as for example might be quantum mechanics, and those theories that are difficult because they require to set aside old beliefs that nobody wants to set aside. Now, the mind-object identity that I defend is not difficult. It's very simple to be understood. Actually, it is just the notion that the thing we are made of is the object rather than the brain. And to
I don't need to know mathematics to understand this.
Exactly. And to understand that physical objects are just something that takes place relative to other physical objects in space and time. Something super simple. Anyone who understands the notion of relative velocity can understand the mind-object identity and will immediately see that it matches very closely with one's experience. But in order to take seriously my theory, people have to give up old beliefs that have been the foundation of most of their work. Neuroscientists have been looking inside the brain for decades. They have been concocting theories more and more complex about how the complexity of the brain is able to produce our experience. And they should have to throw away all of their work, or at least most of their work in regard with conscious experience. And this doesn't look good for people who have spent all their lives working on such theories.
So what you're saying is basically that one thing you have to get over is just the received idea anyway. And again, I remember that Descartes has a wonderful moment where he says it's terrible the way old ideas keep coming back as if they had a right to belong there, even when I know they're stupid. You're saying that, but you're also saying that there is a sort of psychological thing going on, that people don't want to admit defeat, as it were. I mean, yeah. I think we've all experienced that politically ourselves, where we have supported this or that idea or this or that politician, and then very slowly we realize we're going to have to change position, and how difficult that can be because you have a kind of investment in it. But can I say that I think also that the idea that consciousness remains unexplained and mysterious inside the head is psychologically very attractive. It's very attractive because we think, well, if what's going on in the brain is totally different from the other things in the world, then, you know, maybe my brain could survive death. Maybe they can download my neuronal patterns into a computer. Maybe something is going on that's super mysterious that science doesn't know anything about. And so I think that at a very deep collective level, there's a desire that everything remain mysterious. And so the neuroscientists are great because they keep promising something that they never produce. So we can say that we're being scientific, supporting them, but they reassure us that they haven't got there. And it's a very curious situation.
It's very flattering to conceive of ourselves as a mind separate from the physical world. As you said, it suggests that we may have immortality, that we might be an immortal soul, or that one day our mind might be uploaded into a giant computer and to live forever. It is very flattering, and it also It is both flattering and reassuring. It suggests that we are special in the universe, and that it is reassuring because it suggests that we can be sheltered from the nitty-gritty of the physical world. But there's no proof of that. The physical world is just going to decay, just going to evolve.
We should stop using the word physical world. Because you're saying there's nothing but the physical, so why even bother using the word? You see what I mean? If I say physical world, I mean there's some other world, but you're saying there is no other world. Oh. So on this extremely jolly note, can I say though, I want to finish on a positive note. It's true that if one begins to think, and I spent a long time trying to actually live accepting that my experience actually is all the stuff going on around me. The pleasure of it is that one really is here in the world. That experience is real. It's real in that it's the world in relation to my body, even though it might be the world in relation to your body might be different. And actually, I found it very, very encouraging, as it were. Certainly more encouraging than imagining that my brain is kind of cheating me by not telling me how the world really is. Okay, Riccardo, I think enough. I think 90 minutes is enough for anybody. So let's call it a day.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, our books, and thank you everyone for having been here.
I mean, you know, at popular request, we might even do it again.